The wind was a blade against her skin, a merciless sculptor of ice and misery. Alara knelt by the frozen creek. Her world narrowed to the twin agonies of the life forcing its way out of her and the life she was fleeing. Each contraction was a silent scream, a wave of fire that threatened to betray her to the vast, uncaring wilderness or, worse, to the man she had escaped. She had run for weeks, a ghost moving through the skeletal trees of late autumn, her respectable past a torn and useless map. Now the final crucible. She pressed her lips together, biting back the sound that would be her death knell. There could be no cry of pain, no shout of effort. Her baby had to be born in silence, a secret whispered into the heart of the unforgiving frontier. The cold stones of the creek bed bit into her knees as the final, desperate push convulsed through her. A slithering rush and then a life. A tiny, perfect form, slick and still in the frigid air. He did not cry. It was a mercy she hadn't dared to pray for. A tiny conspiracy between a fugitive mother and her newborn son. She tore a strip from her petticoat with trembling fingers, her vision blurring as she wiped the infant clean. His skin a shocking, pale rose against the gray landscape. She wrapped him in her shawl, pulling him against the frantic thrum of her own heart, a fragile shield of warmth against a world that had offered none. The silence that had saved them was now a new terror. Was he breathing? Was his quiet a gift, or a final, cruel trick of fate? She pressed her ear to his chest, and in the roaring silence of the woods, she heard it, the faint, fluttering beat of a heart, her own, and his, a miracle born of terror. That is when the world began to spin, the edges of the forest dissolving into a dark, swirling vortex. The last thing she saw before the blackness claimed her was the face of her son. His eyes closed, his life a question mark she was no longer strong enough to answer. This is the story of a life that began in silence, and the two broken souls who found their own voices in the echo of a baby's first cry. It is a story about the fortresses we build around our hearts, and the quiet, unexpected love that has the strength to tear them down. Have you ever felt so lost that you believed you were beyond saving? Have you ever wondered if kindness is a forgotten language? Then stay with me, and I will tell you how a woman who had lost everything and a man who believed he had nothing left to give found their way home in each other's arms. Her baby was born in silence, a ghost in the wilderness, but the Creekside stranger, a man with ghosts of his own, would be the one to give him a name, and with it, a future. He found her the way a predator finds a wounded deer, by the sheer wrongness of her stillness against the living woods. Silas was moving along his trapping line, a ritual of solitude that had defined his years since the war had spat him out, hollowed and grim. The world had taken everything from him, his wife, his daughter, his belief in anything beyond the clear, cold logic of survival. His heart was a plot of frozen ground where nothing grew. And then he saw her, a splash of color from a faded dress, a woman curled by the water's edge, a small, swaddled bundle clutched to her chest. His first instinct was a hunter's caution. A trap, a trick. The frontier was littered with the bones of trusting men. But as he drew closer, the cold logic of his mind gave way to a distant, aching memory. The woman's face was pale as milk, her lips tinged with blue. She was not a threat. She was a breath away from becoming a memory herself. He saw the bundle stir, a tiny, fisted hand emerging from the worn wool of the shawl. A baby, a child no bigger than the one he held now only in his dreams. A tremor went through him, a seismic shock that cracked the frozen surface of his soul. For the first time in a decade, Silas felt something other than the dull ache of loss or the sharp edge of vigilance. It was a terrifying, unwelcome feeling. Responsibility. He knelt, his rifle resting on the ground beside him. His large, calloused hands, so used to the trigger of a gun and the steel of a trap, were clumsy as he reached out, touching the woman's neck to find a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready beat, a desperate Morse code against the coming dark. He looked at the infant, whose face was serene, as if unaware of the precariousness of his own existence. The silence that hung over the scene was profound, unnatural. A newborn should be wailing, demanding its place in the world. This one was as quiet as the stones around him. Silas knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that he could not walk away. To leave them here would be to bury his own daughter a second time. With a groan that was more rust than sound, he scooped the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile collection of bones and will. He adjusted her so the baby was held securely between them, a precious, vulnerable core. Every step back toward his cabin, a place he had built as a tomb for his heart, was a step away from the man he had become. The wilderness had been his sanctuary because it asked nothing of him. This woman, this silent child, they asked for everything. And as he carried them through the darkening woods, the weight in his arms felt less like a burden and more like an anchor, stopping him from drifting away into the final, desolate emptiness he had been courting for so long. The cabin was a testament to his isolation, a small, sturdy box of hewn logs built to keep the world out. It smelled of pine smoke, leather, and solitude. For years, it had been his fortress, his monastery, his self-imposed prison. Now, as he shouldered the rough-planked door open, it felt different. It was becoming a sanctuary. He laid Alara on his own narrow cot, the straw-stuffed mattress rustling under her slight weight. She was a foreign object in his starkly masculine world, a splash of faded calico against the gray wool blankets and dark wood. He gently took the baby from her arms, half expecting her to fight him even in her unconscious state. But she relented, her body too weak to protest. He held the infant, a terrifyingly fragile thing, and looked around his one-room existence. There was a stone hearth, a rough-sawn table, a single chair, and shelves holding the bare necessities for a man who expected nothing from life but the turning of the seasons. There was nothing here for a child. A surge of helpless anger, an old and familiar companion, rose in him, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. He found a small wooden crate he used for storing dried goods, emptying it onto the table. He lined it with his cleanest spare shirt, the soft, worn flannel a poor substitute for a proper cradle, but it would have to do. He placed the baby inside, tucking a corner of a blanket around him. The child still had not made a sound, his chest rising and falling in a shallow but steady rhythm. Silas turned his attention back to the woman. He built up the fire in the hearth until it blazed, casting flickering shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it to warm. He didn't know the first thing about caring for a woman in her condition, but he remembered the hushed tones of his mother and grandmother, the talk of hot broths and endless rest. He did what he knew how to do. He provided. He hunted. He chopped wood. He kept the fire alive. While she slept, a sleep that was unnervingly close to death, he sat in the single chair, his rifle across his knees, and he watched. He watched the faint pulse in her throat. He watched the tiny, rhythmic rise and fall of the blanket in the wooden crate. He was a sentinel, a guardian of a life he hadn't asked for but was now bound to by some unbreakable, unspoken law of the heart. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft hiss of the fire, the whisper of the wind outside, and the impossibly gentle sound of two others breathing. For the first time in years, Silas was not alone. The solitude he had so carefully cultivated had been shattered, and in its place, a fragile, terrifying hope began to take root in the frozen soil of his heart. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a pale, indifferent sun. Alara drifted in a fog of fever and exhaustion, surfacing for brief moments of lucidity. In those moments, she saw him, the stranger, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette against the firelight, his face a landscape of harsh lines and quiet sorrow. He would be there with a cup of warm broth, lifting her head with a hand that was surprisingly gentle. He moved with a quiet economy, never speaking more than was necessary. "Drink this. You're safe." His words were like stones dropped into a deep well, simple and solid. She was a bird with a broken wing, and he was the stoic, unreadable force that had given her shelter from the storm. She did not know his name, nor he hers. In the silent spaces between his terse commands, her mind would conjure the face she was running from. Bartholomew, her husband. His face was handsome in the way a marble statue is handsome, perfect, cold, and utterly without life. He had courted her with poetry and promises, but once the ring was on her finger, the poetry had turned to possession. He did not love her, he owned her. He had wanted an heir not out of love, but out of legacy. He saw her and their child as additions to his collection of fine things. The memory of his cold hands, his chilling pronouncements of what she was and was not allowed to do, was the fuel that had propelled her into the wilderness. She had chosen the mercy of a frozen death over the slow suffocation of life with him. And now, she was in this cabin, suspended between two worlds, cared for by a man whose kindness was a mystery more profound than the wilderness itself. She would watch him as he tended the fire or cleaned his rifle, his movements deliberate and sure. He had a deep sadness in his eyes, a permanent winter in his soul that she recognized, for it mirrored her own. But unlike Bartholomew's coldness, which was born of arrogance and entitlement, this man's sadness felt earned, like a deep scar from a battle honorably fought and tragically lost. He never asked her who she was or why she was there. He seemed to understand that her story was a heavy burden, and she was not yet strong enough to carry it. He gave her the gift of his silence, a silence that was not empty like her child's, but full of unspoken understanding. One afternoon, she woke to a new sound, a soft, melodic whittling. The man was sitting by the fire, a small block of wood in one hand and a knife in the other, curls of pine falling to the floor. He was carving something. He was so absorbed in his work, his brow furrowed in concentration, that he didn't notice her watching. He was carving a bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The detail was exquisite, a loving creation from a man who seemed to have forgotten how to love. He was making it for the baby. She knew it instantly. This quiet, wounded stranger was breathing life into a piece of wood for a child he did not know, from a woman he had found half dead. In that moment, a single, fragile seed of trust began to sprout in the barren landscape of her heart. The day her milk finally came in, the baby cried for the first time. It was not a wail, but a small, mewling sound, a hesitant announcement of his own existence. Alara, weak but clear-headed, gathered him to her breast, a wave of fierce, primal love washing over her. The stranger, Silas, stood by the door, his back to them, affording her a privacy that was both a courtesy and a shield for his own heart. The sound of the nursing child seemed to fill the cabin, chasing away the last of the ghosts. When she was done, he turned, his face unreadable. "He needs a name," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that this child was not a secret anymore, but a person. Alara looked down at her son. She had been so focused on his survival on her own that she hadn't dared to name him, as if doing so would be to tempt a fate that had already been so cruel. "I don't know what to call him," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Silas walked over to the hearth, his heavy boots silent on the wooden floor. He looked down at the baby, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "He was born by the creek," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A place of life, of sustenance. Faithful place. It always runs." He paused, and she could feel the weight of a memory pressing down on him. "There's a name for that, Caleb. It means devotion, faithfulness." He said the name as if it were a prayer. Alara looked from the stranger's haunted eyes to her son's peaceful face. Caleb felt right, felt strong. It was a name given not by the tyrant who claimed to be his father, but by the quiet protector who had saved his life. "Caleb," she repeated, tasting the syllables. "His name is Caleb." A silent understanding passed between them, an invisible thread connecting three solitary souls into something new, something fragile and unnamed. Later that evening, as Caleb slept in his crate, Silas held out the small wooden bird he had carved. It was perfectly smooth, its wings arched toward the sky. "For him," he said, placing it in her hand. The wood was warm. She curled her fingers around it, a solid piece of kindness in a world that had been built on cruelty. "Why?" she asked, the question she had been holding in her heart for days. "Why are you helping us?" Silas stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his desolate eyes. "I had a daughter once," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. Her name was Sarah. She would have liked a brother. He didn't say what happened. He didn't have to. The empty space in his life was a palpable thing, a cold draft in the warm cabin. He was not just saving her and Caleb. He was trying to mend a piece of his own shattered past. He was giving her son the protection he had been unable to give his own daughter. And Alara understood that his grief, like her fear, was a powerful driving force. It was the reason they were all here, in this small cabin, a makeshift family forged in the crucible of loss and survival. The trust that grew between them was a slow winter thaw. It was in the shared silence as they ate, in the way he would bring in an extra log for the fire when he saw her shiver, in the way she would mend a tear in his shirt while he was out checking his traps. One night, cocooned in the relative safety of the cabin, with Caleb sleeping soundly, she finally found the courage to unburden herself. She told Silas everything. She spoke of her life as the daughter of a scholarly but poor town doctor, of her love for books and learning. She spoke of Bartholomew, the wealthy landowner who had charmed her father and wooed her with false promises. His charm had curdled into control, his affection into a chilling possessiveness. "He did not see me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He saw a pretty object to place in his home, a vessel to carry his heir. When I learned I was with child, I was happy for a moment. But then I saw the look in his eyes. It was the same look he had when he acquired a prize stallion. It was the look of ownership." She told him how she had planned her escape for months, saving small amounts of money, hiding a sturdy pair of boots, plotting a route west toward a distant cousin she wasn't even sure would remember her. She had left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the life growing inside her. Silas listened without interruption, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on her. When she finished, the silence in the room was heavy with her pain. "He will look for you," Silas stated, his voice flat and hard. "He will not stop." A cold dread, which had been hibernating in the warmth of the cabin, awoke and coiled in her stomach. "He is a man who believes the world owes him whatever he desires. He will see you not as a woman who left, but as property that was stolen." As if his words had conjured the man himself, the story shifted. Miles away, in a world of wealth and power, Bartholomew Vance was a study in cold fury. He sat in his opulent study, surrounded by leather-bound books he never read and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. He was not grieving a lost wife. He was enraged by a stolen investment. He had hired the best trackers money could buy, ruthless men with no morals and a thirst for gold. "I don't want excuses." Bartholomew's voice cut through the air like a shard of glass, directed at the cowering man before him. "I want her found. I want my son. The woman is merely the container. Find her. Bring them both back. What you do to her in the process is of no consequence to me." The tracker nodded, a cruel smile touching his lips. The scent of money was stronger than any trail. The world outside Silas's cabin, the world they had forgotten for a few peaceful weeks, was now reaching for them, its greedy fingers stretching across the mountains and through the forests. The sanctuary was no longer safe. The quiet haven was about to become a battleground. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A broken twig on Silas's trap line that he knew he hadn't broken. A distant campfire where none should be. The instincts that had kept him alive during the war, long dormant, screamed to life. He became a different man. The quiet homesteader retreated, and the soldier emerged. His movements became sharper, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. He began to fortify the cabin, barring the door with a heavy beam of wood, checking the loads in his rifle and revolver with a grim efficiency. Alara watched him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. She saw the change, the hardening of his jaw, the flinty look in his eyes. The peace they had built was as fragile as a pane of ice, and the first cracks were appearing. "They're close," he said one evening, his voice low. He didn't need to say who they were. "You and the boy should stay inside, away from the window." The slow-burn pacing of their life exploded. The quiet days of shared chores and tentative smiles were replaced by a tense, waiting silence thick with unspoken fear. Alara refused to be a helpless victim. This was her fight, too. Caleb was her son, her future. "Teach me to load the rifle," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the terror she felt. Silas looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly replaced by a grim respect. He took her through the steps, his large hands guiding her smaller ones, showing her how to pack the powder, set the ball, and prime the pan. The weight of the weapon was immense, a heavy burden of responsibility. But holding it, feeling its cold, solid reality, she felt a sliver of power. She was no longer just the damsel in distress. She was a mother protecting her child. They came at dawn. 3 of them, their figures emerging from the morning mist like specters. And leading them, astride a magnificent black horse, was Bartholomew. He looked just as she remembered, impeccably dressed, handsome, and utterly soulless. He stopped a short distance from the cabin, his lips curled into a sneer of contempt as he took in the humble dwelling. "Alara!" His voice was smooth, cultured, but it carried the lash of a whip. "This pathetic charade is over. Come out. Bring me my son. I will be merciful if you do not make this difficult." Silas stood inside, by the window, his rifle raised. "He's not your son," Alara whispered, clutching Caleb to her chest. The baby, as if sensing the tension, began to fuss. "That is my property you are holding," Bartholomew called out, his voice laced with venom. "And you, whoever is in there with her, you are harboring a thief, a runaway. Send her out, and I will let you live." Silas's voice was a low growl, carrying easily in the still morning air. "She is not property, and this is my land. You are the one who is trespassing. Leave now." A cruel laugh escaped Bartholomew's lips. "Brave words from a peasant in a hovel. You have no idea who I am." He dismounted, pulling a polished pistol from his belt. "I will have what is mine." The confrontation was a clash of 2 worlds. Bartholomew, with his belief in the power of wealth and station, and Silas, with his belief in the simple, unassailable right to defend his home and those within it. "This is your last chance," Bartholomew shouted, his voice tight with rage at being defied. He gestured to his 2 hired men, who began to advance on the cabin, their own weapons drawn. The world shrunk to the small patch of cleared land in front of the cabin. Silas fired first. A puff of smoke, a deafening crack, and one of the hired guns crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. It was a warning shot, a perfectly aimed message that said, "I am not a man to be trifled with." Bartholomew's face contorted in fury. This was not how it was supposed to go. Peasants were supposed to cower. He raised his own pistol and fired wildly at the cabin, the bullet thudding harmlessly into the thick logs. Inside, Alara huddled over Caleb, shielding him with her body. But her mind was racing. She was not the same woman who had fled in the night. She had survived childbirth alone in the wilderness. She had been cared for by a good man. She had a son to protect. She would not be a passive observer in her own fate. She saw the spare rifle, the one she had learned to load, leaning against the wall. With a surge of adrenaline, she laid Caleb in his crate and grabbed it. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was iron. While Silas reloaded, the second tracker was using the distraction to creep along the side of the cabin, heading for the single, shuttered window at the back. He was moments from smashing it in. Alara saw him through a crack in the boards. She remembered Silas's instructions. "Brace it against your shoulder. Line up the sight. Squeeze, don't pull." She rested the heavy barrel on the windowsill, took a deep breath, and fired. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force. But through the smoke, she saw the man stagger back, dropping his gun, his hand clutching a bleeding arm. He stared at the cabin in disbelief, then turned and fled into the woods. She had done it. She had defended her home, her family. Bartholomew stood alone now, his hired help either wounded or gone. He looked from Silas, who was now taking aim again, to the cabin window where the second shot had come from, his face a mask of shocked fury. He, Bartholomew Vance, had been bested by a hermit and a runaway wife. His arrogance and his power had proven useless against their simple, desperate courage. He stared at the cabin, his eyes filled with a black, possessive hatred. With a final, choked cry of rage, he turned and scrambled onto his horse, galloping away, leaving the scent of gunpowder and thwarted tyranny hanging in the cold mountain air. The threat was gone. The silence that descended after the confrontation was more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence born of shock, relief, and the dawning realization that they had won. Silas slowly lowered his rifle, his knuckles white. He turned and looked at Alara. She was leaning against the wall, the heavy rifle still in her hands, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce, newfound strength. He saw not a victim but a warrior, a lioness who had defended her cub. "You're a good shot," he said, the words an inadequate vessel for the admiration and awe he felt. She gave a shaky laugh, the tension breaking. "I was aiming for his hat." A rare, small smile touched Silas's lips. The barrier of his grief, the wall he had so carefully constructed, had been irrevocably breached. In that moment of shared peril and victory, they were no longer just a protector and a survivor. They were partners. The threat of Bartholomew was gone, but his shadow lingered. Silas knew men like that did not simply give up. He rode into the nearest town a few days later, a place he hadn't visited in years, and sent a carefully worded telegraph to an old army commander, a man who owed him a life. He explained the situation in sparse military terms, trusting the man's integrity. The wheels of a more official justice began to turn, ensuring Bartholomew Vance would be entangled in legal troubles that would keep him far from the mountains. When Silas returned, he brought with him supplies: flour, sugar, a bolt of soft flannel, and a small, leather-bound book of poetry for Alara. It was a gesture that spoke volumes more than his terse words ever could. Said, "I see you. I know you. This is your home now." An epilogue of seasons began to unfold. The harsh winter gave way to a vibrant spring. The creek thawed, and the world turned green again. Caleb grew, learning to crawl on the cabin's rough-hewn floor, his gurgles and laughter filling the spaces that had once been occupied by silence and sorrow. Silas taught Alara how to track, how to read the language of the forest. She taught him how to read the poetry he had bought for her, her soft voice bringing the words to life by the firelight. The ghosts of his past did not disappear, but they quieted, their mournful whispers replaced by the living sounds of his new family. One summer evening, a year after she had arrived, they sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Caleb took his first faltering steps, walking from his mother's outstretched hands into his father's. For that is what Silas had become. Not by blood but by choice, by devotion, by love. "I never thought I'd see this again," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion as he held the small boy in his arms. "A home." Alara leaned her head against his shoulder. "We built it together," she said. The cabin was no longer a fortress against the world, but the center of it. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most broken things can be put back together, not as they were, but as something stronger, something more beautiful. Redemption had not been a grand, singular act, but a series of small, quiet moments. A shared meal, a bedtime story, a hand to hold in the dark. And so, a life that began in the terrifying silence of a frozen creek found its voice in the heart of a loving family. A woman who was running from a life of gilded cruelty found her strength in a humble cabin. A man who had buried his heart in the wilderness found it resurrected by the love of a woman and the child he chose as his own. Their story reminds us that hope is not a fragile thing to be wished for, but a resilient force to be built, log by log, choice by choice. It teaches us that true strength isn't about the power you can wield over others, but about the courage it takes to protect and to love. It proves that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you find, the one you fight for. Have you ever been shown a kindness that changed the course of your life? Have you ever found a home in an unexpected place? Their journey was a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to heal, to love, and to build a future even from the ashes of the past. It is a story whispered on the frontier wind, a tale of love, redemption, and the quiet courage that turns survival into a beautiful life. If their story has touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. What part of their journey resonated with you the most? Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that even in the darkest wilderness, a light can be found. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit.